What is going on, everyone, and welcome to today's stream. I am so happy to have you all here. It seems that people are filtering in as we speak. I've got some exciting topics today to talk about. As many of you had saw before, we have Dr. John Clippinger from the MIT Media Lab, as well as director at the Open Earth Foundation. We're here to talk about some crazy out there topics. I've been speaking with him over, the kind of the past weeks. I'd originally saw him present at the NFT Summit a few weeks back, and it was just an incredible presentation and something that I knew I had to get him on here to speak to you all. And today we're going to be covering a number of different topics, but really the overarching emphasis that we're looking to put out on this is that as we move into the future and decentralization becomes a thing, this idea of economy and what drives this is going to be fundamentally different from anything that we've seen so far. A lot of this is based on way old kind of Newtonian stuff, and how moving into the future is going to be different. And with this introduction of NFTs and kind of digital provenance, it gives us the ability to create value through net new assets, or really asset combinations, which is really, it's a mind shift that I think a lot of people haven't quite seen the possibilities here. And we're going to discuss ways that like Bayesian mechanics could really be a blueprint for the fabric of the future, and how we introduce and model so that we create a future that's fundamentally stable and not something that's just extractive, and much more generative. So it's going to be a good time. And with that, thank you all for joining. We've got the chat open, so please, at any point in time, post questions. Love to see activity in there. We're going to run through the talk. At the end, we'll do some Q&A. And at the very end, I've got a few things to give away, which should be pretty cool. We've got some swag, we've got some gift cards, so stick around. And at the end, we'll be doing a little fun giveaway tour. But with that, I am now going to introduce Dr. John Clippinger. Hello, hello. I think you might still be on mute if you are. Oh, I had him go on mute before this so I could do my intro speak, so that's my fault.
Now can you hear me?
I can hear you. How are you?
Very good. It's good to be here.
Yes, sir.
It's
Well, hey,
fantastic.
yeah, thank you for coming on. I know that we've got a lot to get through today.
Yes.
And we've been kind of speaking over the past couple weeks a few times. It's been fantastic. I can't thank you enough. This has really, really been a shift in my understanding of what NFT mean for the future. Well, with that, I would love you to start. If you could just give us, kind of an intro about yourself, how you found your way into, into blockchain and NFTs. Yeah, I think we'd all love to hear it.
Okay, just a quick background. Currently, I'm at the MIT Media Lab. I've been there about 13 years. Originally, I came and worked with Sandy Pentland, who's a human dynamics group. And he and I formed a nonprofit called ID Cubed. This is about 2011. We were interested in decentralized systems, digital institutions, new kinds of currencies, smart contracts, things that before the blockchain had really taken off. So it was, but we were particularly interested in how do you create new decentralized forms of governance, self-organizing systems. My background is my doctorate was in linguistics and artificial intelligence quite a while ago. But I've always been interested in self-organizing systems. How do you design systems based on the principles of life? And I've been affiliated with a number of organizations, including the Santa Fe Institute. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but they've done a lot of work in complexity. They were one of the first to look at, take a cross-disciplinary look at things. That's typically now what they do at MIT, at the Media Lab. And more currently, I'm at the City Science Group, where we're actually trying to apply these ideas into designing new kind of urban and living environments. And more recently, I've gotten very involved in the whole issues of climate change. And how do we create an economy that is not going to tear the planet apart, but help rebuild it? And how do we build our institutions on that basis? And so before I was at MIT, I was at the Berkman Center at Harvard law school, and set up something called the Law Lab, and that was computational law. We used this was like 2004,
Hmm.
and we were using genetic algorithms to create smart contracts and exploring those ideas. I've also started a number of companies, 5 or 6 companies. So I've been in and out of their entrepreneurial space, but more recently, sort of advisor to a lot of companies around the blockchain. And I was an early advisor to Bancor. There are a number that are coming in. Started a company called Switch, which we that was in Switzerland, which was was first sort of one of the first crypto companies. And Switch was trying to use NFTs actually, and this was 2016, to do verification of sustainable energy through solar, and created exchangeable digital asset. Now it's called ClearTrace, and they're now deploying an exchange for digital assets around the verification of sustainable energy. I think it's the beginning of a new kind of infrastructure around that. So I've been really interested in sort of tracking and seeing how these ideas have developed. I've also, I think, in our conversations, looking at machine intelligence, artificial intelligence. How do we understand how we organize ourselves in new ways that reflect the latest science, and how we go on a principle base of social organization that just isn't sort of ad hoc
Hmm.
or based upon superstition and fear,
Right.
and concepts that really don't work. So, and this is sort of a lead into sort of what our conversation would be, but always looking for a new move in science that is grounded in basic principles, can explain what sentient things are, what intelligence is, what self-organizing system is, what is the best principle for sort of designing and organizing things. What are the first principles that you can do things on? So
Hmm.
that, I mean, that's sort of a nutshell, where I come from.
Yeah, well, I think your nutshell is is expansive as far as the number of areas that you have worked in, leading up until
Right.
now. It's incredible. I really what I think is has been really interesting along all of this is that a lot of it seems that for what we've talked about, a lot of this stuff hasn't really been possible until NFTs, and this is around the new asset classes and how you can do all of these things that we're going to be talking about, and really the basis of that comes down from fungibility and
Right.
non-fungibility, right? So I mean, if you were to hammer the importance, and the majority of the crowd here is understands blockchain, but the importance of fungibility and non-fungibility as it
Yeah, I
relates.
think there's a real sleeper concept.
Mhm.
And when I first started getting involved in doing NFTs, I mean, it was right before crypto's kitties had come in, and it was sort of seen as, okay, it's a cute little thing, and it has a limited life, but everything's about a ERC 20 or things
Mhm.
like that. Everyone's doing their ICOs, and so you have this anomaly. Um, and But when you really think about it, and I really think people need to understand the concept of fungibility. I didn't really get it until I really sort of dove into it.
Mhm.
But what made the internet so great originally? It was sort of its blessing and its curse. Was the fungibility of things? Is permissionless. Anyone could create content. You could change the content. You could modify the content. You could change your name. You could change your identity. You could be anything. There was no there were no rules, and so one thing's replaceable by another, um, and there was no certification of provenance, and that became a big issue in identity. This one of the things I originally got involved with, this whole concept of self-sovereign identity, and giving people control over their own data. That's one of the reasons I went to the Harvard Law School, is work on that, and got involved in the whole identity, self-sovereign identity stuff. Um, but is that if you don't have a root provenance, then you don't know what you're dealing with, and so there's certain things that really aren't fungible. In other words, are irreplaceable. The planet, the climate is irreplaceable.
Mhm.
If we lose our climate, we're sort of out of it. Our biosphere is irreplaceable. So there's not one, you can't substitute one thing for another. I mean, the power of the pricing mechanism is extremely powerful. I mean, and so at some point, everything is dictated by price, particularly on the financial markets. It's sort of the difference between Wall Street and Main Street. Main Street, there's limited fungibility, but if everything is basically, you can run it up to exchange and one kind of asset is replaceable by another by price, then you can extract out the value and you don't have to replace it and put it in. And so this is, and people have seen, oh, this is the great free market. This is laissez-faire. This is the fair of laissez-faire. It's a mechanism that was really, our markets and our market thinking is inherited from basically Newtonian classical mechanics. And this is a fact. If you look at the major economists, where they got their ideas, how they developed the formulas, and the whole idea of pricing and clearing is comes from sort of a classical mechanics. And that's fine for dead things. That's actually, you can extract out the value, there's nothing left, and then you go off and do something else. And people say, well, that's a market clearing itself. But in some cases, there's nothing left. It's what Schumpeter called creative destruction. But there's no learning. Things don't build upon things. Living things don't do that. Living things have memories. They have feedback loops. They have a boundary condition which they maintain. There is a sense of who they are, and if they violate that boundary, they do no longer exist. So, for us, we have to have our temperature boundary. If any living thing deviates too much, it's no longer a living thing. So everything you do is based upon preserving that over time. But that is what biological life is versus inanimate creatures. And so we've been organizing ourselves socially on sort of Newtonian principles. And it's, we've been able to extract a lot of value, all of fossil fuel, we've taken it off, but we created negative externalities. So, and there's no way of counting for it. The incentive system is to that's a cost. You push it out. You let someone else pick it up. Now, typically they'll say, well, okay, the private sector is free to do these things. They're, quote, market failures. And there'll be the public sector will pick this up and clean up the mess. But what happens, and this happens all the time, is that independent party gets captured by the interests of the private sector, because it's in their incentive not to have to incur that cost. It's built in. And so you have these negative externalities building up to the point now where it is really putting our planet in peril. And it has the social consequences because it creates extreme disparities. Organizing systems don't allow self-organizing systems don't allow that. They're a living entity. So your brain can't say, well, gee, I'm going to take all the blood from the heart. Fuck it. I'm out of here. No, we're interdependent. We're a living thing. And we have to maintain those interdependence. There's something that's irreplaceable. I can't say, well, I'll replace my heart with my ear. No, I've got to have a heart in order to be a living thing. Now I can balance things out, how much resources I want to allocate to it. But at some point, there's a boundary condition that creates that a living thing. Now, I think what we find in the work that's come out of the sort of self-organizing system based in mechanics, in Carl Friston's work, and I can go into talking about him, but he is really an extraordinary polymath. He's the most cited scientist in the world. He's 274,000 citations. We can imagine that. He's a neuroscientist. He's a physicist. He's a mathematician. He's an MD. He's a psychiatrist. He's been at this. He's worked with Geoffrey Hinton in the early machine intelligence group of DeepMind out of when they were in London. He runs he's in University College London. He runs a center there. But Carl is really interested in extracting out basic principles and grounding them in physics. And so what he's saying, what is the science of living things? What does it mean to be an active inferencing thing and change yourself and modify yourself? And so he's developed a school of thought, and he's not alone in this. It's a fairly growing community. It's not well known in the AI community. I mean, it's very interesting. The machine learning group, if you look at the citations and bibliographies, you don't see any sort of lots of reference to his work. I mean, but though he does draw on the work of Judea Pearl, who is a well-known in the community. He developed the concept Markov blankets. He's developed the whole thinking about causal relations versus correlations. And so Carl's built on his work, and he won the Turing Prize and stuff like that. So I think there's a new school that's coming out. And what they're doing is not just looking at correlations, but causal relations. They're what they call dynamic causal models. And you run models, you run policies, and the point of the whole thing is what they call free energy minimization, is that natural systems, when they will naturally dissipate, living things try to minimize the dissipation of energy and capture it and internalize it in a way that it expresses who they are, their particular phenotype.
Mm-hmm.
And they model the environment they're in. So it's not like you're an adversarial environment. You actually, there's a theorem called the good regulator theorem by Conant and Ashby, that a good regulation is being able to model one another. Mm-hmm. And so what they've been able to do is develop some criteria for how to design things in an optimal Bayesian design, both in terms of being explanatory, predictive value, and economy of value, and what that iterative process is. And it just doesn't apply to biological carbon life forms. It applies to digital forms. And you can describe, and it's domain free and scale free. So that's a pretty massive claim. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's saying we can talk about biota and we can also talk about massive populations with the same framework, and we can tie the two together because we can understand them as nested living systems. Mm-hmm. So these are quite extraordinary claims. I mean, and they certainly should be tested. But Carl has had extraordinary success, and there are others like him. I mean, I have a good friend, chair of Johns Hopkins biomechanics, and he does computational anatomy. They're doing computational models. It's a lot of the same principles. Mm-hmm. It's very testable, and they've been able to infer using this method from neuroimaging the structure of the brain at different scales, and then predict certain kinds of functions that not have been observed. Mm-hmm. To say, well, there should be that kind of mechanism. Lo and behold, there is.
Right. So just to make sure that I'm like grasping where we're at on all this, right? Is that and I was reading some stuff earlier more into like extractive economies versus generative economies, and that basically our entire mental model of how the world should work from an economic point of view really, I mean, roots back from forever ago, from the time that we were harvesting the land to eventually banking, and then liquidity and loans. And I heard it explained that like if you watch the growth curve or like the GDP of what the world tends to measure itself on, or countries tend to measure itself on, you can follow the airplane up, and it's going up. But the difference with this airplane is that it can never land, because it can never crash, right? And this concept and understanding of how our economy is developed is on this extraction principle, which is we are constantly pulling from somewhere without giving back. And the negative effects from that pool, like an example would be fossil fuels, the extradition of that produces value through cash, money, number of other areas, but the negative externality that's formed is, for instance, like greenhouse gases. And if you think about these extractive markets, these negative externalities are what is basically leading us down this road to a potential like planetary biosphere collapse. But what we're talking about here is that there's a new way to think about economy that is fundamentally different from extractive, and that is generative, meaning that an economy can exist outside of what classical Newtonian physics and the extractive model is, which is what all humans have really understood, and I think what everyone gets taught in business school of like extract, grow, growth.
Right.
When
well, we have our exit. We got to exit the planet now.
Right.
Where do we exit? There's no.
Right.
Keep exiting. Right. Maybe Bezos can do it and Musk, but not everybody else.
Yeah.
Right.
But I mean, we're getting to a point now with with NFTs and this ability to have digital provenance, that you can create new markets, and you can create value within the digital realm that minimizes the amount of negative externalities, and you can actually model it, the economy itself, more around living things, which that science of living things is Bayesian mechanics,
Exactly.
and that whole ability has really like never been possible until now. And the uptick outside of all of that I thought you had mentioned before that was incredible is that if you can create new markets and you can create new asset classes, basically much more easier, you can start to drive social agendas, right? And you can start to actually drive away those negative externalities, because you can create economic incentive for people to actually to actually like do good, right?
Superior incentives. Yes,
Right.
absolutely. Yeah.
And you had mentioned before, and I'd love for you to kind of give the example again, but you had mentioned that like an example would be is that if you can create a new asset class with, like, for instance, solar and battery, and now if you if you combine those two together, and we have a new asset class there, you can actually drive economic incentive for people to move in that direction.
Yeah, let me build on that. I mean, there's and I'll get to that example. There's a related example that a synthetic biologist friend related to me, was that it sort of brings us to life. Literally, is that when they had the COVID, when they discovered COVID, they did a digital model of the COVID. It was 30,000 bits, I think. It was very small, the virus. They were able to transmit that globally, and then they were able to synthesize it and then study it. So the fact that we put things in a digital form and we can model them and we can iterate. I mean, this is where the genetic algorithms come in. We can look at different combinations of things and set constraints. So typically in genetic algorithms, you have a fitness function, and you're able to take different kinds of things and combine them and then select for certain traits. It could be a molecule or whatever it is. But now we're doing it with physical things. This is where I mentioned Autodesk has done this. They actually have a whole process of generative design and manufacturing. So when you think of an asset, you really think of it as having certain properties, certain attributes, and and from the active inferencing point of view, everything that has a set of intentions around preserving what it is. So it lives in a niche. It wants to preserve that niche. It wants to evidence itself. It may even modify a niche in order to better preserve certain states. Um, but that ability to be able to then combine different assets over time to create new compounds. It's like a single cellular to a multicellular organism is what you're getting. So when we talk about the batteries, one of the things that we found in working with energy is that you look at solar by itself and you say, okay, here's one class of assets, but if you combine it with another with a development in batteries, then what happens? Batteries, you're able to store it during the night, and then with computers you can do demand response. So you create a new kind of entity that together suddenly solves a class of problems that each of them by themselves did not. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a basically an adaptive selective process, a generative model whereby they come together and they solve a class of problems, and that creates enormous value. That's generative value. um, and so that's what a lot of technological innovation is anyway. You have different generations of phones, you have different generations of computers, certain components become cheaper, memory becomes cheap, processors, and suddenly you have the iPhone, which you couldn't have before. um, and that's a whole new class of experiences, a whole new class of products. What we can do by pushing that into the metaverse is actually accelerate that innovation and reward that innovation and make and capture the value of that innovation, put it back in innovation and direct that innovation towards actually addressing the issues of concern. So the generative model for the technology would be to reduce carbon in this sense, would be to be affordable. So you can combine multiple goals and then you solve the problem in a sense through iterative generations of changes come in that create these new kind of artifacts, and that can be digitally done. So the cost of that is minimal.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why I think that the metaverse is going to be the fusion of the metaverse and the physical world. You can create things you never did before, like in the areas of governance. You can have encryption. You get zero knowledge proofs. There are ways in which you can have oversight without capture by using these kind of techniques that you can't do in the physical world. So I think we're on the cusp of a really fundamental redesign of not just economies, but certain kinds of institutions. Smart contracts are just the tip of the iceberg on this. But NFTs are very important because it shows that you can verify the uniqueness of something, and that NFT can be dynamic. I mean, it can have permissions associated with it. It can be programmable itself. So, and then it can adapt and combine with other kinds of things. But it has its own agency.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the other thing that we had talked about that I thought was really compelling is that the the importance really around where we're heading to in the metaverse and what's enabled by blockchain and NFTs is that the fact that we can like creating a new asset class is one thing, but I think you had mentioned it, the speed that we're able to do it with now, with the minimal amount of overhead that we can start pushing markets into the right direction that reduce the number of negative externalities is really what's groundbreaking, because the clock is ticking, right? No matter what they say, the clock is ticking, and our ability to now look into the future and say that we are actually on the precipice of creating the Web3, the metaverse, this whole new,
Really, a whole different, yes.
a whole different world. We're at the phase where we should be modeling it, where we should be thinking about how are we going to do this in the right way, instead of just continuously looking backwards and saying, well, let's take what the economics that have been developed however many hundreds of years ago, and we'll just apply that now, because that's just going to lead us down the same road. So this concept and what you're bringing to the table is saying, like, look, people, we should be looking at this like a living organism, so that it's built in a sustainable manner, rather than this just I don't want to say like.
I think that to that point, I mean, see, one of the things we're doing, we're not alone, is the Open Earth Foundation, is that all the a lot of major gaming platforms are building this, the digital models of the Earth. You're really getting these digital twins that really have high fidelity representation of the physics and the activity of the world. And so we're looking at Earth as a living thing, and it has its own metabolism at multiple scales. So that the Carl, for instance, there's a number of atmospheric scientists that got in, and they say, well, can we model the guy as a living system, and then how different things are embedded in different scales within that system, and how they affect each other. And then how do you create the incentive structures, the financial incentive structures, to have people to make this transition? How do you suck the money out of the fossil economy and to put it into an economy that's denominated in terms of sustainable way, in a measurable, sustainable way? And if these techniques are really powerful, then they have prediction, and they have better prediction and risk mitigation than you have in traditional methods. So there should be a very strong financial incentive to be able to do this at some point. The financial signals, I think, are very important. If we're going to do this at the speed that we have to do it, it's going to have to come through trusted financial signals that work within this context. But you're starting to see that. See, I mean, I mentioned, CryptoKitties. They have 1 billion genes. I mean, it was a natural experiment. It just came about, right? It was brilliant. And now you have Axie Infinity is another example of that taking into the gaming world. And then you have things that I think would be done by Terraforma Labs with the Anchor protocol, the Terra. There are rethinking monetary fiscal policies and instruments that create a new kind of infrastructure that doesn't require the traditional banking system, a banking account. And it can have competing or superior returns. The federal rate, so to speak, for the Anchor protocol for Terra is 20%. If you can lock that in, you can that banks are not going to do that. Right. So what happens to the Federal Reserves? What happens? This is big stuff. What I like about it is that it's really principled. You said, well, you just can't throw. There could always be hot air, but at some point you can test it and validate it and scale it, and it works. And then you can challenge it, and it starts to work. And I do. This is what, again, I come back to the Bayesian mechanics. This stuff is principle based. Um, so it's analogous in my mind to what James Clerk Maxwell did in terms of his equations of electromagnetism. I mean, he did put it all together, and it was an invisible world that he made visible that virtually enabled computers, electromagnetism, the whole, how we live today. I
Hmm.
think we're going to do that in another scale, in another dimension, with this living technology.
Right. And
It's a modest. I mean, but I think it's there.
yeah, I do, and where it's an interesting time for sure, right? And I mean, something that I thought was compelling that you had given on the talk previously at the NFT summit was you gave the example of CryptoKitties, right? And how each CryptoKitty in and of itself has a genome, which we can think of as just traits. And if we get to a point, or if we look at assets or potential assets as having lists of traits within of themselves, then if you use something like genetic algorithms, you can tell it its end goal where it needs to be, and then you can provide the traits of different asset classes, and then the algorithm can like figure out how to manipulate everything together to get there.
Exactly. I mean, one of the things that active interesting model does, it has a set of expectations and beliefs. In other words, and I'm not sure how to describe this. It's almost like a a phantom asset class. It says if this thing exists and has these properties, it will have this value.
Hmm.
So you say, "Whoa, okay. Now, what does it take for that to have that value?" Well, if I do this, I invest in that. Suddenly, I cross a threshold.
Hmm.
I mean, when you just think of what the cost of computers, I'm old enough to know when they say, oh well, you think of the cost of Rolls Royce and the cost of computers and how that is such a fraction now. And so by that the cost becoming diminished, the performance come up. You create a whole new envelope of possibilities. And what happens, markets don't think of things in that coherent way. They don't look at the independencies. You look at things as isolated assets, and then someone puts it together and creates a product of it. But if you can understand the dynamics of how they interact and generate those combinations algorithmically, and then value that accelerates it.
Hmm.
And so I think we're on the edge of doing things like that. As I mentioned, Autodesk is done a lot. There's one of the examples I gave was an algorithmically generated office building for Alibaba, done by Foster and Partners, and he's one of the biggest. He's one of the biggest architects in the world. Um, so you're taking very complex problems and you're generating constraints combinations, and you're identifying constraints that, if solved, then open up new thresholds of possibility.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's beyond human beings to do. I mean, that's really that you can take 10,000 generations and do them in minutes, that kind of thing.
So we're so we're at a point where it's gonna get. I mean, interesting. I mean, what I also like find just so like fascinating about all of this, like to tie it back to the NFT thing, is that this whole concept of leveraging asset traits in order to combine them together to create new assets, which those assets then can be pointed to social good and things that are good for not only the environment but humanity as a whole have never really have never been possible at the level and at the scale that we're sitting at right now. We're literally sitting at the starting line, really. I mean, at the end of the day, we're sitting at the starting line, and this is all about the head off. And if we can go into this, and I think something for people watching, that one of the interesting things is that if we can walk into the future with this idea of looking forward rather than looking backward, and instead of I don't want to get like philosophical here, but instead of with like the greed complex, but looking more into how to combine and move things in a direction that's better, that creates more sustainability rather than just extraction and exploitation out of raw materials and other things. Overall, the market and economy itself is going to be much more. The longevity is going to be longer because hopefully we will still be
Not
here.
only longevity, but you actually generate more value. It'll outcompete. I mean, I think you're going to innovate at a higher level. You're going to be able. I mean, the difference between a single cell organism and a multicellular organism. Yeah, there are a lot of single cell organisms out there, but the complexity of compounding and cooperative and complex networks of things create all sorts of value that there wasn't there individually.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think so we're on the threshold of doing that. So it's not only less expensive to generate these new combinations, but it creates new kinds of value that we couldn't even imagine beforehand.
Mm-hmm. And we had spoken about. I want to leave some time to go through these because we had spoken about like really getting like way out there on the capabilities. I think you know where we're headed now, but like the capabilities of NFT, and this idea is that if you can provide digital provenance to something, you can provide uniqueness to it, and if uniqueness is one of like the cornerstones of self-identity, and as we move down the road and we progress in AI and machine learning to a point, and if we apply Bayesian mechanics to start to generate more of these living things, if it's going to be a wild kind of thought experiment to think about if AIs are able to identify and have like not I don't know if like conscience or sentience, but an idea of self-worth, and then they themselves are generating value or coming together with other ones to generate value. What does that mean for for markets and for economies and for people? Like it's kind of an
I think we have this fiction that we have this omniscient view of understanding things. I mean, I mean, this is I mean, we talked about this earlier. I mean, that's why I prefer this concept of sentience to intelligence, because I mean, I can go on a riff, but intelligence is a relatively new concept. It was really developed by Spearman in 1908, and it was really an attempt to say, looking at a unique evolutionary advantage of humans over anyone else, and a particular group of humans over anyone else, I might say. And what one knows in looking at complex adaptive system, there's no one single trait that is all uniformly adaptive. You really, I mean, you can. This is one of the fathers of self-organizing system. This was his premise, Ross Ashby, and I thought, there's got to be something. But because what can be an advantage at one point is a disadvantage at another point. But what is in sort of the law of the good regulator or regular variety is the richer and more diverse your representation is of your environment and yourself, the more flexibility you have, the greater sentience, the greater awareness, the more there's more information there. That 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 has advantage.
Mhm.
And so you want to increase the sentience. So yeah, I think we're a part of a process that is creating things that are going to know things that we don't know already. I mean, people can't perform the way a computer can. I mean, come on. There's certain things that we can't do very well. We're not as strong as a machine. We're not
Right.
as quick as math is a machine. I mean, there's, let's the exceptionalism, us being the measure of all things, and this is another point I made in my talk, was the same point made by Sir Francis Bacon, is that people are not the measure of all things. It's to understand to command nature, you have to obey nature. You have to understand it. You're within it.
Hmm. Hmm.
The extent to which you're within it and understand it, model it, then the extent to which you're successful. But you
Right.
can't stand above it. It's like a Gödel problem. You can't get outside the bottle.
Hmm. 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 So we got a question coming in, and it is so An NFT is generative within its own asset context. Does that necessarily mean it's generative within a social human context? Or could there be NFTs with interest at odds with human interest? So could they be, I guess, be negative externalities, right?
Well, I think that I mean, this is a really good question. I think, that they can have their own, if it has its own generative model and it has its own representation of things and its own set of goal states, it is conceivable that at some point that it could be at odds with what human our species has. I mean, so I mean, there's a lot of argument to be made that there's an interest in mutualism. In other words, there's interest in each party modeling the other. Yes, so it's not necessarily a zero sum game all the time. It's generally you can say it's a cooperative game, but there can be conditions which it could be a zero sum game. And that, in other words, if you have a higher sentience and that it has a richer representation and that we have a lower representation, um, we may not be our solution may not be the winning solution.
That's when the dystopian future strikes in, right? And it gets kind of ran away.
I mean, he's a dystopian. I think that we are. I think we're all already at a point of re-speciation. In other words, is it a fixed point of what we look at? What we are already incorporating technologies into ourselves. There's a whole concept we call extended cognition, that it says that what our cognitive abilities are not just what's contained in our head, but distributed around us. And so we are relying upon these things, and then we're incorporating technologies into ourselves. We're dependent upon them. We're tinkering with our genes. We're CRISPR. We're not we're not the end point. I mean, I just don't think that's the case.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. Yeah, it is a time to be alive. But hey, I look. So we are,
Yeah.
but we are bumping up to the end here. So I'll put it out now. If anyone else in the chat has any questions, now is your time. We've covered a lot of ground here. Everything from, basically starting out on the fundamental difference with fungibility and non-fungibility into Bayesian mechanics, into different economic models, how the future itself with decentralization is going to change, the impacts of that on things like climate, combinations of asset classes pushing social agendas, into all the way into AI and the future, and what does sentience mean in it. So I would say that we have covered some ground, if even to say that. But we do have, so another question. I love the question, so please, people, keep them coming in. This is typically the best part of any of these. But one of these is, so what can we learn from play-to-earn games like Axie that redistribute income back to players in relation to outside goals like wealth, income inequality, and environmental protection?
Exactly. That's what I really like, Axie. I think, one of the things that I was working on and did part of it was developing a legal framework for a new kind of firm that acted on these principles. And it's a paper I did for the Journal of Computational Law at MIT, and it's called Reflexive Mutual Organization. And the idea is to create value and capture it and put it back in and build reserves within the community, within a legal, which would be actually a mutual organization. And we're experimenting with different kinds of conversion rates for tokens and things like all the stuff which now you're seeing being done in Anchor and Terra. And Axie. So their design intent is very different, say, than a Facebook. It's what 95% of it's owned by the community. It goes back into the community. They have a plan whereby they'll vote on a DAO, and Sky Mavis may not even be involved in it anymore. That is so different than Mark Zuckerberg. It is recognizing a new form of organization and value creation and retention, And I really I just applaud that kind of invention, and I think it's going to happen in the gaming world. I'm not a big gamer, but I just look at what the creativity that's coming out of that, and what they've been able to do and apply those game mechanics, and then actually translate them into economic mechanics, and then engage people that they get participation. And people, they don't even think about this as a blockchain, as this, an NFT. It's like, no, this is cool. This way to do things, and suddenly they're generating value, and they've broken the hold of an old capitalist system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so we got, speaking of capitalist system, we've got another good question in here, and I'm actually kind of curious about this one too. It's that, so what is, what's the role of government going to be in all of this, in this realm as it evolves? Because it seems like, there's this level of like infrastructure and providing on the physical side, but then you've got things like DAOs and stuff that exist and work really well in the digital realm. So is it going to be some form of like symbiotic relationship between the two, or?
This is a really good question. I've really been interested in the whole governance issues, and I think for the last 20 years. And so how do you have digital governance and distributed governance? And then people talk about democratic principles, translate those into us. So should we translate our democratic, quote, democratic institutions into a digital space? I say no. I mean, I say they're an artifact of another era. I think you have to, it's a fundamental redesign. And I think that, when one looks at voting and say, okay, and representatives, and you elect representatives, your judiciary, things like that. But as we all know right now, all of that gets so captive, it doesn't scale. It's very complex. And so what you see in the digital spaces is some really interesting ideas on how to decentralize governance. I don't think you import the old stuff into the new stuff. I think there's so many tools that you can use. I mean, one of the ones that I'm interested in is the whole idea of who guards the guards. So that's always the big problem, because at some point someone has power and they recapture it. But there are ways in which you can, through encryption and keys and zero knowledge proofs, you can avoid the capture by one small group of others, and you can distribute benefits and not make it capturable. I think a lot of people are emphasizing transparency, and the idea of trustless. But I think the question of capture is another big issue, and how do you avoid capture? But I think that can be done. But again, you're getting some really interesting experiments that are coming out of. I referenced Terra again, and Axie, what they're trying to do. These are gamers.
These are,
They're not constitutional lawyers, right? I mean, that's what's so fascinating to me.
yeah, yeah. So I think the last question that we're gonna have to get to before we do give away some swag and give away some other stuff is that, so, we covered a lot in future momentum. What should we expect in 2022, and what would mature certain concepts or scenarios?
That's great questions. I think I think 2022 is going to be really interesting, because I see and I'd be interested in this group what their thinking is, because of the maturity of the next layer. You're getting the interchange protocols, you're getting the speed, you're getting some real applications built on top of stuff. So if you look at, Terra and Chai is their payment system. There's 2 million people on that. We're not doing it because they're in blockchain. So it's moving into a consumer space. Now, if you're able to show 20% returns in a fairly risk-free way, or just a comparably risk rate, then I think it's a breakout. I really do. I think that, and I think there's, I won't get into the particulars, but there's a lot of baloney out there in terms of tokens and what they can do, and overstatements, and there are a lot of stuff that I think are just science projects going nowhere. But I do think, and there's a lot of maximalist belief in certain, but there are certain things that are getting knit and put together that work and scale. and that if someone can engage a broader community, and I think the gaming world is this, and that ties into the real financial community. That at some point, someone starts to making a lot of money. Then there's things called ESG metrics, which I think which is ESG funds are environment, social, and governance funds. They're supposed right now. This it's a bogus metrics. It's a greenwashing thing, but they recognize it has to be better. They're like $60 trillion. If that money can be deployed and starts moving into the space, then we're on a really interesting run. And I think that maybe not next year, but I think in the next 2 to 3 years that something like that will happen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, with that, I think that we are almost at time. I could probably sit here and talk about this forever, and I will probably grab.
All right.
I'll probably grab you for some time or coffee at some point to discuss.
Sure, absolutely, love to. Thanks for the opportunity here.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you so much, everyone. This is Dr. John Clippinger. I'm going to send out to. So we've got some leave behind stuff. I guess one other thing is that. So you mentioned that you're currently writing a draft version of a paper, and that curious on feedback. I don't know if I should be sharing that or if that's something.
Yeah, well, I'm working on a book on this stuff, so I'm trying to gauge the response and the ability to communicate this. So all feedback's always welcome.
Yeah,
for there too. There's still getting some of these ideas out.
Yep. So if anyone that joined has any feedback, please make sure to reach out to me with it. I'll be more than happy to pass it along. But with that, I will bid you adieu.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Signing off. Take care.
Well, thank you everyone for joining. We've got the last little bit up. That was, it's one of those things too, where it's like, you start with an agenda and it's like, I'm going to go through these things, and then you just get tangential. And the next thing you're talking about like AI and like all other kind of crazy shit. So that was good though. Again, it's a really interesting topic. And what I was really hoping to convey and really push forward this is that everyone sees NFTs and all they see is dollar signs, or they see, like fake rocks and shit like that getting shown. But there really is a larger plan, a larger opportunity behind all of this. And that's what I would love everyone to walk away from that, and that there is actually much more fundamental shift and change going on that I think a lot of people in the typical market really don't understand that's happening. So this hopefully shows some light on that. If you have any questions about it, please let me know. And with that, I'm going to call in the mod to help give away some swag and a gift card. So we've got, I think it's 4 to give away. So you got pretty good odds. And my Corey counterpart, I will call you up, aka in Slack, to give me a little bit of. I need to get like a sound clip for like a drum roll. You know what I'm saying? All right, Corey, are you still in the chat? And the first winner is. Send me the participants link. Oh crap! Sorry guys. All right, 2 seconds. I actually don't know how to do that. Well, this is embarrassing, huh? How do I do it? Sorry, dude. This is all your fault, Corey. All right. Let me see. I'll get rid of this. I'm just going to do this. Corey, I'm just going to shoot you screenshots of it because I don't know how else to get to it. And then you can pull from there. Everyone bear with me. And we will get into it. If anyone in chat too wants to say, like, I don't know, interesting points around it, I think I'd said originally to him, like, we had started kicking off talking, and I had just reread I Robot from Asimov, and I was like, man, like, in order to have AI, you need to have like something to anchor it, and if NFTs is that, and man, let me tell you, I'm talking about a rabbit hole. It was there. All right, 2 seconds. And the first one in his random scrambler is Eduardo. Eduardo, are you in the chat? Hello. If you are, say hello. That way we know. And the Next runner up is, let's see if I can put on some music too while we're doing this in the background. Oh, all right. Hopefully we should have some tunes to go with it. And Andres Novoseth. I am butchering names, and I am so incredibly sorry. Reading comprehension is low, so I don't know on the stream yesterday. Andres, you are in here as well. Let's see it. It's because you have got some swag and or a gift card coming your way. You are in there. We are on to number 3. Christian, Mr. Edwards, Mrs. Edwards. Christian, are you in the chat? If so, congratulations. You are getting some swag and or a gift card coming your way. And the last one up, thank you all again for joining. This has been fantastic, is Puel Janka. I just want to go hide in a corner after I try to read names. Sometimes it's horrible. Thank you so much for joining. I apologize to any of you that I missaid your names. Once again, thanks for joining. I'm Corey from Gixter, and that was Dr. John Clippinger. And with that, I think we were done for the day, and it's also almost happy hour. So with that, Keith, do it. Yep.